We took a look at a great deal of urgencies to address on our first interview of this new season, but one global agenda easily trumped all: the race to vaccinate against the coronavirus. It's been 2 months since vaccinations began in South Korea, but there are criticisms around the speed of inoculations, with also the looming possible fourth wave. There's also the public concern over the causal relationship between the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines and the rare but evident blood clots. This is all against the backdrop of, the highly contagious variants driving up infections worldwide. Clearly, we desperately needed an expert opinion. So joining us on the line today is Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Welcome to the program, Dr. Kim.
Thank you.
It's actually been roughly 4 months since the last time we spoke, Dr. Kim, and I'm a little afraid to ask, how have you been?
I'm fine. Actually, I've been vaccinated.
Because you're American.
As a military retiree, I was vaccinated at Yongsan.
All right. I did know that because I looked up your interview with Asian Boss. All right. I am completely aware of your background, but some of our listeners may not be. So let's give them some context. First and foremost, the role of the International Vaccine Institute that you head. Could you explain IVI's mission and how has it been responding to the pandemic?
Thanks. Well, IVI actually is the first international organization headquartered in Korea, and its mission is to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. For COVID, we decided that we weren't going to try to develop our own vaccine, but rather we were going to partner with any organization, company, university, private research laboratory that had its own vaccine that it needed help in developing. So that help could be by means of animal testing the vaccine in animals, testing whether the vaccine will protect certain animal species from infection. That might be a suggestion that it might protect humans. Helping companies that are executing clinical trials. So if company A wanted to test a vaccine here in Korea or outside of Korea, then we could help them actually do the clinical trial, which is something we do very frequently, or we could help them by analyzing the samples that come from that trial. And then finally, IVI has been working with other international organizations to try to improve our thinking around the use of a vaccine, or how we could potentially manufacture more vaccine, or how we could get that vaccine out to more people. And now, with vaccines that are available, working with companies and other international funders to understand whether these vaccines actually work in the real world. Do they do what they're supposed to do?
I actually really like the slogan that you repeatedly use in other interviews. IVI actually discovers, develops, and delivers effective and affordable vaccines, which would also imply that you're interested in getting these vaccines to the less developed parts of the world, right?
Yes. Our focus is primarily those parts of the world where vaccine access has traditionally been a major problem.
Okay.
And we would anticipate a similar problem for COVID vaccine.
There are actually a lot of public concerns surrounding vaccines, and sometimes I do think that media headlines don't necessarily help with that matter, which is why we decided we needed to ask you. First and foremost, public concern over the safety of the vaccine. So just for our listeners' context, I do have all the facts lined up here. The EMA, the European Medicines Agency, announced last week that the AstraZeneca vaccine was linked to blood clots, but again stressed the benefits outweigh the risks. The WHO echoed the statement. The Korean KDCA responded by halting the use of AstraZeneca vaccine for those under 30. A panel of independent experts to the American CDC said it needs more time to assess risks over the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Pause. So given all these headlines, what would you say to those who are worried about receiving these AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines?
That's a great question because, vaccines, unlike medicines, are given to people who are healthy, and the goal is to keep them healthy.
Right.
All vaccines, all medicines have side effects, and I think everyone's familiar having taken a medicine with feeling drowsy or, feeling nauseated. Or after having gotten a flu vaccine, having pain in the arm or feeling achy or tired. But these vaccines were developed very quickly. And although we didn't cut any corners on safety, and in fact, the vaccines were investigated in tens of thousands of people. I think over 200,000 people worldwide have participated in vaccine clinical trials. Mm-hmm. There are going to be rare events that occur. And unfortunately, the syndrome of low blood clotting cells called platelets and blood clots has been found with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Mm-hmm. And it appears to occur with a frequency about 1 in 100,000 vaccinations. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine right now, just based on the data that exists, it's happening a bit less frequently, 1 in 1 million vaccinations. Mm-hmm. So to give people a sense of proportion, your lifetime risk, and this is if you were in America, I don't know what the risk is in Korea, but if you're in America, your lifetime risk of being hit and killed by a lightning bolt out of the sky is about 1 in 100,000 to 130,000. So it's a pretty rare event. Mm-hmm. Against that, you have, even if you're 30 and you were exposed to COVID and become infected, you have a 0.2% chance of dying. Mm. And, so if we prevent 100,000 infections in 30-year-olds, we're going to prevent a huge number of deaths. Against that, we have the possibility of, 1 or 2 blood clots. And so when people talk about risk, they're talking about the total benefit from vaccination, that is preventing tens of thousands of infections and deaths against the potential risk of a blood clot. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to assess. All vaccines have rare complications. Mm-hmm. And when experts review these complications, they have to very carefully weigh the benefits of vaccination against this. And, I don't know if many people have taken the yellow fever vaccine, but if you travel to Africa or to Latin America, you should definitely have received it. Mm-hmm. But it has a risk of complications, as does a vaccine against diarrhea that we give to children called rotavirus. On the other hand, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives a year around the world. So we do have to balance risk against benefit.
All right. That's as sound as any. I mean, it is very similar to, I think, what the WHO has repeatedly said about benefits outweighing the risks. But it seems that all the experts agree on that matter. And the numbers are pretty clear, too. Actually, South Koreans, majority of survey takers, as of the latest surveys I've seen, are still more inclined to get vaccination shots than not, which I thought was a promising lead. And this is clearly important, and I think South Korea's key goal in trying to reach herd immunity by the month of November this year. And frankly speaking, with the distribution process in South Korea particularly, it seems kind of unlikely. So when do you think we'll actually start seeing the vaccine's impact in South Korea?
So, it's actually not only the vaccine, but it's the other behaviors that we've been, using for the last year that have protected Korea largely from the impact of the COVID pandemic. I mean, we see 600, 700 cases a day in Korea, a country of 51 million people. We look at India, where there are, hundreds of thousands of infections a day, or in the United States, where they might be at 50 or 60,000 infections a day. And, the ability of the Korean government and the Korean people to use those standard protection measures like distancing and masks has been remarkable. The flip side of that is once we start vaccinating in Korea, and I think significant increases in vaccination will start to occur in May, June, and July, we'll still have to continue to use masks. And why do I say that? Well, we have data. In the United States, it's between 30 and 40% of the population have received vaccine. In Chile, the same thing. Both countries are having very, very large outbreaks. Mm-hmm. Vaccination has to be considered in the context of continued use of masks and distancing. Mm-hmm. We can't let up. And it's a total package of prevention. I guess that's the best way to think about it. You can't only rely on the mask. You have to use the vaccine. You have to use other prevention mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, the vaccines are great. Mm-hmm. We do know that they protect people against the development of mild PCR positive, so that nasal swab test that people do, disease. We have less evidence that it protects people actually against infection, which means that you could take the vaccine, you may become infected, but you probably won't get really sick. However, you can probably still spread the virus.
To
So if you get
other
infected,
people.
if you've been vaccinated and infected, you don't get sick,
Right.
but you could still pass it on to others. So one of the reasons to wear the masks, as it was before, protect yourself. The other, and probably the more important reason, after you've been vaccinated, wearing the mask protects other people in case you get infected.
All right, which also brings me to my next question. Contagious variants are also a point of concern. Some health experts have alluded to annual shots like a flu shot. I mean, perhaps the how immune I would be to the first set of shots may not be everlasting. So will coronavirus vaccines be updated according to some of these new mutations?
Yeah, so actually that makes slightly different points. I think the first one has to do with the use of what we call boosters.
Right.
And many of us received a tetanus shot when we were younger, and every decade or so you should get a booster to remind your body's defensive system that it knows what this is and that it should continue to maintain protection against it. So that's a booster. With COVID, it may be necessary to develop new vaccines.
Completely new vaccines.
So the flu vaccine is either 3 different flu viruses together or 4. And do we need to do that for COVID-19? We're not sure. Right now, the vaccines that we have appear to protect against severe disease even with the variants. But will that always be the case? We're not sure. Possibly not. And are there parts of the world that have large, uncontrolled outbreaks that could be generating new viruses, new variants that may not respond to the vaccine? Possibly. One of the reasons, in fact, to help other countries around the world and to move quickly as possible in Korea is that whenever you have these large outbreaks, and we're thinking, the outbreaks, for instance, in Brazil or in the United States or in Europe, that's where you get the generation of new variants and viruses that could undermine the achievement that we have with 10 different vaccines showing safety and efficacy.
Because as you've mentioned the last time I spoke to you and today again, that all of this is happening at lightning and unprecedented speed, I do think it is important for all of our listeners to remember to keep our social distancing guidelines in mind, which is why I do think I can assume what your answer will be to my next question. Over in Israel, the country will lift the requirement to wear face masks outdoors since more than half of the population has been vaccinated. What is your opinion on this step?
So, Israel has been in the lead in many senses with regard to vaccination, with regard to being able to show that vaccination, primarily with the Pfizer vaccine, is associated with significant decreases in hospitalization, which is a wonderful thing. And I hope that by November of this year, Korea will be in the same position. What we don't have a good idea about, I think you've heard maybe Dr. Fauci say on television, or you've heard experts in Korea talk about reaching 70% of the population, and that we'll be at herd immunity then. Now, herd immunity doesn't mean that you're not going to get, that you can't get infected, or that the disease will disappear in Korea. I think many people remember last year we had a measles scare.
Yeah.
Actually, it's now 2 years ago. We had a measles scare. There were imported cases of measles that were occurring in people who were under-vaccinated or, in very rare instances, unvaccinated. But what happens then is that rather than spread to 500 people, the outbreaks were very limited. And that's what herd protection does. It doesn't necessarily prevent infections. It prevents the infection from spreading. So hopefully there will be a point where we understand exactly when the best time is to start releasing those social distancing requirements. Now, and I think you've seen in the United States, and now we're getting evidence from Chile, that even with vaccination rates between 30 and 40%, you can still have substantial transmission, substantial hospitalization. So we have to be very careful. And does anyone at this point know the magic number? No. We're going to have to watch the number of infections and hospitalizations. And I would guess that the Korean government, if it follows the pattern that it has before, will be relatively conservative and slowly back off some of the requirements. But we'll have to look at the data. And I think That's going to be a very important part of vaccination rollout in Korea, is looking to see what the impact is on infections, hospitalizations, and deaths.
Perhaps it's a little bit too early for us to have this discussion, but because it seems like governments in trying to open up their border again for international travelers and make trade easier, we've been talking about vaccine passports for already weeks on end. It's been brought up in multiple countries, including South Korea. Some say it's, again, too early for such a discussion, while others believe it could be used in an effective way to ensure safety during travel. So what are your thoughts on this issue? Is it a good idea? Will it be effective? Or is it polarizing?
So, I think that when when the world decides, or countries decide to start accepting each other's vaccination certificate, there are going to need to be some assurances. Countries need to be able to assure each other that the vaccination certificates are real, that these are actually a certification from the government that a person received vaccine X or vaccine Y. Will it be limited to countries that have used vaccines that are approved by what we call stringent regulatory authorities, that is like the EMA or the MHRA in the UK, or have WHO emergency use approval? Or will it be all vaccines? The Russian vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, which haven't necessarily yet received WHO approval. Will it apply to all countries with quarantines? So that, for instance, one of the things now is you could always travel out of Korea.
Right.
But when you come back, you have to be in quarantine. So
for 2 weeks.
I think that for many countries, the question, or for Korea, the question is, when do we allow people to skip quarantine? Or, do we require that they be tested 48 hours before travel, on arrival, and then 72 hours after arrival, but let them out of quarantine, as long as they obey the societal restrictions around the use of masks, the country's restrictions. So those are things that still have to be worked out. You can imagine someone who doesn't follow the rules, who isn't wearing a mask, and is simply vaccinated, going to a country where vaccination rollout has been very slow. So, there are outbreaks. A person can contract the disease and unknowingly spread it to other people in his or her group, to other people within the country. And really, if that's the case, then the vaccination passport hasn't done anything but allowed introduction of new viruses into the community, or introduction of viruses back in the country where the person returns. So we have to be very careful, and we have to have mutual standards that can be agreed upon between countries that will allow safe travel.
In our previous talk, you actually predicted that the world would be able to return to something of a normalcy in 2022. I'm so careful with that wording. Are you still sticking to this prediction, or should we just adjust what we define as normal?
The new normal. Yes, I think, high-income countries in particular will probably be done with the bulk of vaccination by the end of 2022. It's going to be more difficult to ensure adequate levels of vaccination in other countries around the world. And really, the participation of the Korean government in something called COVAX, which is a international effort to ensure that all countries around the world have access to COVID-19 vaccines, is really critical. I think we have data now that if we don't provide vaccine to all countries in the world, global COVID deaths will double. So there's a direct humanitarian impact for not making sure that everyone has access to vaccine. There's a huge economic impact. A number of different groups now, one of them, the Brookings Institute, the other one, the National Board of Economic Review, have estimated that it will cost developed countries, the high-income countries, $4 to $5 trillion if we cannot somehow provide better equity in the distribution of COVID vaccines. And then we have now an intelligence estimate from the Director of National Intelligence in the United States saying it's not going to be over until everyone is vaccinated around the world. So again, multiple different pieces of evidence saying that we really do need to not only vaccinate Korea, but vaccinate people around the world and provide that kind of herd protection everywhere if we are all going to escape from the threat of COVID-19.
One of our listeners asked a pretty interesting question. His name is Nikolai. Are certain vaccines more effective in one nation than as opposed to other nations?
That's a great question, and it's exactly the right wording, effectiveness, because it's really around, does the vaccine protect against not necessarily mild infection, but severe infection, hospitalizations, and deaths. And right now we don't have the answer to that. Based on the preliminary data that we have, almost all the vaccines appear to have very high rates of protection against severe disease, and that's what we want. Will they continue to do that? Not sure. And, the emergence of mutants in South Africa and Brazil and now in the United States and India are raising concerns that maybe we will start to see a decrease in effectiveness. Remember that the vaccines were tested primarily against the variants that were circulating in the early part of 2020. And although they still appear to work, we do know that the levels of protection that are seen against mild to moderate disease appear to drop, although the level of protection against severe disease remains relatively good at this point. We don't have the information available yet. In general, the vaccines that develop stronger protective or immune responses may be associated with better protection against the variants. And I would call that scientific hypothesis based on some scientific data, but it's not been shown or proven yet.
Dr. Kim, if I had it my way, I would just keep you on the line and bleed into the next hour. But unfortunately, we can't do that. You have a full day ahead of you. One last question, because I have a hunch that nobody asks you this. Is there anything you would like to do once the pandemic ends?
I would like to go home and to Hawaii.
To Hawaii. That's home for you?
It was the vacation that was canceled. The first one that was canceled in March of 2020. And so we haven't been back for a while.
Dr. Kim, it is my hope that will happen for you sooner than later. Thank you so much for joining us on the line once more. We hope to connect with you again in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.